We're continuing today in our sermon series on the Gospel of John. The overall concept is finding fulfillment through truth, love, and faith. That's the overall theme. At the heart of this prologue that John is giving at the beginning, we recognize this, and John did as well, that science can attempt to answer questions such as who, what, when, where, or how much. But only the king and queen of the disciplines, philosophy and theology, can answer the most pressing questions of life, which is the why. And that's why Rick Warren wrote the #1 bestseller of all time outside of the Bible, which again, the Bible at its heart is a purpose book. It answers the question, what on earth am I here for? What's the purpose of my life? What's the purpose of love? What's the purpose of the universe? People have been debating that since human beings have had the ability to reason. Now, John comes right out and says, I'm going to address this question, but ultimately the reason that I am addressing the question of purpose, what on earth am I here for, I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to persuade you. I'm trying to give you the information you need. Why did I write this? So that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. What is this? A purposeful life, an abundant life, Jesus was going to describe. Now, thus far, when John starts pinning this, you had Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which focus on the narrative of Jesus' life, what Jesus did while he was here on earth. John is much more so going to focus on the why, the theology, the philosophy of what Jesus taught while he was here, and the person of who Jesus is. So I want you to imagine this. If he's writing a book and his purpose is so that we might be persuaded or enlightened to believe in Jesus Christ and find life and purpose in his name, I want you to imagine that he's going to build in a case like he's an attorney. And week after week, this is what I'm going to be doing. I love the Gospel of John. I hate to say it's all downhill from here, but it's really my favorite book of the Bible to preach. Not just my favorite gospel, but my favorite book of the Bible to teach through. Because of the depth of what John has done here. But let's always remember, every week when you come here, I'm going to present a new witness, because that's what John's doing. I want you to believe in Jesus, he's saying. May I call to the stand witness number 1. Now, witness number 1 rarely wins the case before the jury. But witness number 1 is always foundational to everything else that is going to be argued before the jury. Do you understand that? And so if you forgot what witness number 1 said, then what witness numbers 7, 8, 9, 10 are going to say later may not make as much sense to you. So I need you to hang on to this prologue, this fundamental foundation that he is laying here to understand witness number 1, which is, may I call to the stand the universe. I'm asking the universe to give testimony as to what will truly give us life on this earth. What will give us purpose? What will give us meaning? So let's remember, John is not writing to a niche. He's trying to write to the Hebrew people. He's writing to the Roman people. He's writing to the Greek. And so back and forth, he's going to regularly use different metaphors that would have meant different things depending on the culture that was receiving this. At the beginning, he talks about this concept that the Greeks and the Romans had, but especially the Greeks. It comes from the Greek word for a word, which meant logos. If you're listening now online and you didn't hear last week's sermon, please go back and listen to that before you complete this one, okay? Logos is, their definition, not mine, the divine reason implicit in the cosmos, all right? Now, this word cosmos is a Greek word. It's exactly the word. Cosmos, we say in English, means cosmos in Greek. Same exact word, okay? And it means the order of the universe that gives it form and meaning. What is the purpose behind the universe that keeps it together, that holds everything together and gives it meaning in life? Is the universe just this random association of particles flying around, or is there a meaning and driving force behind it? We see this in all major religions of the world. We see it in movies, in media. At the heart of all the Star Wars, we're on trilogy number 10 now, I think, okay? In the heart of all of these, that's what the mentor, Obi-Wan, sits down with Luke and he explains to him, here's the meaning behind the universe, is this force behind it that's been around since the beginning. Now, when we say the beginning, this is something the Jews were always asking for, as well as the Greeks and the Romans. If we could go, and that's why as a society, we have this sense, like we're always searching for what happened at the Big Bang, what caused that, what's the meaning behind the universe. Our origins determine our purpose. The Hebrews understand this, the Greeks understood it, the Romans. That's why there's so much argument in the world, is because they're saying, is there a purpose behind the universe? The devil would want us to say there is no purpose, it's all just chaos and disorder, but all religions in the world are looking for that meaning and purpose, that philosophy, that theology behind the universe, and that's how the Jews would say it, but the Greeks would say it's logos. That's that meaning. So that's why John opens up his book with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning. Now watch what he did. He's saying this force beyond the universe, this meaning of the universe, this logos you're looking for, is a person, not an impersonable force. He says all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Now this is important for us to understand. I'm going to put this in a Christian lens for you, okay? If you read these verses through a Christian lens, and this will be right. A friend of mine shared this with me this week. It's a great way to look at it, and it's 100% correct from a Christian point of view. Watch this. He's going to say the Word is God, the Word is Jesus. He's making that point. If we interpret it Christian lens, read it this way, it's 100% accurate. In the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. Jesus was in the beginning with God. Through Jesus, all things came into existence, and nothing that exists came into existence without Jesus. Doesn't that make a lot of sense if you read it? So as Christians, if you read it that way, you're like, oh, of course I know what that means. Okay, why? Because a lot of you have been raised in a Christian culture, a Christian context. It's important to note from this, is it possible from these verses that Jesus was created? No. If Jesus was created, then this bottom sentence would not be true, because it says nothing came into existence apart from Jesus, and if Jesus came into existence, then that would be apart from his self-existence. This is what the geek stuff is already starting to fly, all right? Here we go. Now, I'm going to ask you, however, to put on, because this is who this book is written to, people who grew up in a Greco-Roman context. And that is always our goal. We never want to read our Bible as if John was writing to 21st century America. Here's the clue, he's not. And if we read everything as if he's writing this to Americans who live today, we're going to miss a lot of what he's trying to communicate. Our first job when we're interpreting the Bible is to understand what it meant to the original audience. John was thinking, how do I persuade, how do I show people that there's life in Jesus' name? And so we need to understand what he's communicating. A lot of what I do in here as a pastor is I'm trying to communicate first to you, this is how they thought and how they understood it. Once we get that concept, then we can understand how we are to think and how we are to understand it. Does that make sense? I'll say it again another way. We must know what it meant to another before we can know what it means to us. Okay? So, this is what they would have heard when he says in the beginning was logos. Okay? The driving force behind the universe, and that which gives us purpose, logos, has been the same since the beginning of time. That force was with God, and that force was God. It was in the beginning with God, and through that force, all things came into existence, and nothing that exists came into existence without a driving force behind it. Okay? Now, here's the deal. If I would say to you as Christians, watch, in the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God, all this, since you were raised in a Christian context, if I say this to start talking to you, you would say, well, of course it was. Everybody in here, if you've grown up in the Christian faith, you're going to receive this as truth, okay? Makes sense to you. You're not fighting back on any of that. In the same way, this is saying the same thing the same way to a Greco-Roman audience. The Greeks were going to read that and say, well, of course it is. Of course there's this force that drives the universe and gives us meaning. Let's talk some more about that. And that is what John is doing. This is an evangelistic technique that's very biblical, and it actually works. The methodology works. If you are wanting to convince someone or persuade someone to agree with you about something over here, you first got to begin with something you agree on, right? If you've been married any length of time, you understand that. You don't come at them and say, let me tell you about 5 things I disagree with the way you're living your life. A lot of us argue that way in our homes, but it doesn't end very well, right? So you learn over time. Let's start with what we agree on, such as, hey, we need to get along in front of the kids. Okay, we agree with that. Now, let's talk about how we might do that. That's what he's doing here. Let's start out with what we agree on, that there's this force or this purpose that gives order to the universe, and we need to search for what that is. To which the Greeks and the Romans and the Jews would say, of course, I'm with you. Let's go. Okay? So that's what he's doing. He's answering the why that everybody from all world religions would be searching for at that time. He's answering purpose, and he's using a metaphor here that goes along with the light of creation. What's this idea? Like all major religions have this idea that there is this creative account and there's this purpose, this energy force that is driving things in the universe that reveals truth to us. This is why he writes, going back, put in context, all things were made through him, a person, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, now watch this, and the life was the light of men. That life that gives us meaning in person, that force, is also the light of men. That force will enlighten us. And what he says here is the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Watch the metaphor he's using here. He's using something they know to take them to something they may not quite understand. But honestly, in the Greco-Roman context, they already accepted this concept. Is that the metaphor of light and the metaphor of darkness has always symbolized in all 3 of those contexts I mentioned earlier, okay? Light represents good. It represents knowledge. It represents enlightenment. Like you're living in the light means you're living a good, righteous life and you're at peace with yourself and others. Darkness causes harm to self and others. And what it's saying is when light exposes the darkness, it brings light into darkness to where good overcomes evil. And everybody deep down wants to believe that someday the good is going to win. Now, when it talks about this light that shines in the darkness, watch this metaphor. When Jesus, they're asking him, who are you? Later he says to them, I am the light of the world. This metaphor that you use all the time, like let's bring light to darkness. I am the light that needs to come into darkness. I am the light that scattered the darkness. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, he says in John 8:12, but will have the light of life. Now watch what he's saying. Not only am I the light, but if you want the light of life, you're going to find it in me, and you won't find it in the things of the darkness of the world. Now, when we get to chapter 8, we'll talk a lot more about that, but I want to go back to the metaphor, which is the light. And this goes back to this concept, this Greco-Roman and Hebrew concept of what happened in the beginning and what was the force behind that. Now, when we read John 1:1 in Greek, which almost all the readers, obviously all the readers of John 1 would have had to be able to read Greek or they wouldn't be able to read it, okay? In the beginning, he says, the first words, he says, NRK. It means in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. When he's doing this, he's clearly connecting this for the sake of the Jews to what we would call the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. Okay? Now, NRK was also the word that the Greeks would use as to the philosophical, what many in science today would call the Big Bang moment. NRK. That was their Big Bang moment. Okay? The beginning of the universe. So he's saying, in the beginning of the universe, that's what John 1:1 says. Now watch this. If we go to Genesis 1:1, the Greek version, and it is something called the Septuagint. Now let me give you a little background on this. What is the Septuagint? This is going to click for you in a moment, but hang on. Jews back in the day of John, first century Jews that lived outside Jerusalem, the vast majority of them, their primary language, listen, was not Hebrew. They could read Hebrew, they could read the Hebrew Bible, but it wasn't their primary language. Even today, we have some Japanese students who join us. When they study, when they want to read the Bible, we don't say, hey, you should read the English Bible all the time. We want them to read a Japanese Bible. Doesn't that make sense? Because that's their heart language, and when you go to matters of philosophy and theology, you want them reading something that they understand the language the best. Because the Jews who lived outside of Israel were immersed in a culture and went to schools, even if they were Jewish schools, because they wanted them to thrive in that culture, their primary language, those Jews that lived at the time of John, would have been Greek. It's the same way today. Dee and I took a little anniversary trip one time to a tropical island. And I remember when we were down there, the first couple days were kind of peaceful, but then we hit the time when the schools in Brooklyn take their Jewish spring break, okay? And I'm not kidding you, 10,000 Jews descended upon Aruba. And we're sitting here in the Marriott Hotel, and then, I mean, there's Jews everywhere. I mean, they got the little kippas on, but they're in their trunks, but they still got the kippah on, all right? So it was a cultural experience for me. I'm sitting in the hot tub, we're talking about their conversation or whatever, and I just listen. When I'm ever in another culture, I love to learn about other cultures and other people's. Maybe I'll share the gospel if I can get it in. I'm listening. I will tell you, I learned a lot about investment the week I was down there with the Jews. Okay? I'm just sitting there in the hot tub. Now watch this. I'm sitting there in the hot tub, and I'm hearing these Jewish investors over here talk about what they got their money in. Why was I able to understand everything they were saying? Because they were speaking in English. If they wanted to exclude me, they had the ability to speak Hebrew. They knew Hebrew. They went to Hebrew schools. In the number one concentration of Jews in the whole world. Do you know where the number one concentration of Jews in the whole world is? It's in Brooklyn, New York. You have a higher percentage of Jews living in Brooklyn than you do in Israel. Did you know that? So here they are, they're sitting there and they're talking about their investments or each other, and then I start talking about their schools, how they study, and I asked them, I said, hey, you guys, when you're in school, how many classes in your Hebrew schools are in Hebrew? And they said, just one. I said, what class is that? They said, Hebrew. Like it, when they're studying, it's one class just like when we take Spanish. Otherwise, they're speaking in English. It was the same way in the first century. This is why this is so important. When in the English or in this Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the first two words of what Moses wrote that the Jewish people would have been reading in Greek, their Hebrew Bible in Greek, in what was called their Septuagint, that's kind of like saying their King James Version, the first words were NRK, in the beginning. So what he's doing is he's building a bridge, watch this, between the Greek concept of logos in the beginning and in the beginning of the creation according to the scriptures. In the beginning, he says, God created heavens and earth. Imagine this is in Greek, the Hebrew version or the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. Now watch what happens in verse 2. It says, the earth was without form and void, here's that metaphor, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now watch what here. In verse 1, we see God, which we would refer to as God the Father. In verse 2, we see the second person of the Trinity, the Spirit. Now, I will tell you that, and I'd have you pray for a new friend that I met when I was in Egypt a few months ago. We were just having coffee, and again, I'm listening, learning about his culture or whatever. And I said, would you be open to talk about my beliefs a little bit? Sure. So we're talking about Christianity and how he believes Jesus was a prophet and how Jesus was born of a virgin. And I said, well, man, let me just ask you a question. What keeps you from becoming a Christian? He said, well, that's an easy answer. Here's what I and most Muslims really have a problem with. He says, you Christians believe in 3 gods. I'm like, well, what makes you say that? He said, well, you believe in God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. We only believe in one God. I said, really? I said, you believe that Moses, what he wrote in the Torah, you believe that Moses was a prophet, right? I said, well, in Genesis 1:2, it talks about the Spirit of God. And then I said, and in Isaiah, it talks about how God sends his Spirit. I said, let me ask you a question. I said, even in the Quran, doesn't it talk about God's Spirit going out from him to accomplish things? About God sending his Spirit in the Quran? And he said, yeah, it talks about. I said, if there's only one aspect of God that you understand, how do you send something out from yourself and it still be one and the same? And he says, I think I know what you're saying. I said, let me say it again. If you and I are together and I send you, the only way that can happen if there's 2 different concepts of who we are. There have to be 2 persons for one person to send the other person. He said, that's true. I said, so if God is sending his Spirit, then that means the Spirit is the second aspect of his person. He said, that's true. And I said, man, the only difference between me and you is I believe it, as you would say it, I believe in 3 gods, you believe in 2. Because you believe in 2 persons of God, I'm just saying I believe in a 3rd. And he said, you got me there. And so he said, I want to think about that. That kind of ended the conversation. But he said, I'm going to have to read on that. I'm going to have to chew about it. I say that to say, now watch here. In verse 1, you see God the Father. In verse 2, you see God the Spirit. I think, and it doesn't have to be this way, it's just my opinion, but a lot of theologians hold this, that in verse 3, when it says, let there be light, it's a representation of when Jesus claims to be the light of the world, as is referenced here. Now, obviously, it's not being created. We're not saying Jesus was created by God any more than this verse is saying that light was created at this point. And I'll show you what I mean, okay? The question is, what or who is the light behind this life force behind the universe? Well, here's a hint. It's not the S-U-N. How do I know that? Okay? How do I know it's not the S-U-N? Just if I would have asked you before today, and if I would ask 99% of Christians, when I ask them this, I'm going to tell you the answer that they get. When I say, in the beginning, God said, let there be light, right? When he said, let there be light, what gave that light? And 99% of Christians will say that light was what? From the sun. That's what 99% of Christians will say. There's no doubt most Christians will say, well, God created the sun at that point. Not on day 1. Look at what it says in day 4 in verse 16. On day 4, God made 2 great lights. The greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day. So I will say again, if the light in verse 3 was not the light behind the power of the universe, if it wasn't, I will say in verse 3, if it clearly was not the sun, because the sun wasn't created in day 4, whether you take that as a literal 7-day creation or some kind of theological evolution over time, which I don't believe in, but even if you do, the sun followed the creation of light. It wasn't at the same time. So then the question becomes, well, what or who is that light which is behind the force that creates the universe, okay? Now, to get into that, now I'm really going to get nerdy with you. How many of you had chemistry in high school? Raise your hand if you had chemistry in high school. Okay, that's a lot. Physics. Did you have physics in high school? Wow, okay, I'm surprised. That's a high number. How many of you had either college chemistry or college physics? Raise your hand. Okay, that's a lot. So I'll see how you do on this. I'm going to break it down a little bit. Used to be Now, I just hear gas, like you're all in the middle of finals. Like they're having shakes right now, like they're going to get finals in a week. Okay. If I would have asked 100 years ago, Jeff Leach, I'll ask you, I know you've had these classes, all right? So I'm not going to embarrass you, I promise. If I would have asked you 100 years ago while you were taking organic chemistry or whatever, okay, what is the smallest unit of matter? 100 years ago, the correct scientific answer would have been what? Don't make it complicated. It's not a trick question. An atom. That's it. For the longest time, we thought that the smallest unit of matter was an atom. Well, now we know, like, and this is what 4-year-olds would do. We're like, hey, Daddy, what's the smallest thing we can see? Well, we can't even see it, but the smallest thing out there is an atom. Well, what's an atom made of? And then that's where we go, blah, 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 blah. We don't know, okay? But now we know that atoms are made of something. Now, we're going to let you show your chemistry knowledge here, all right, or physics knowledge. What are atoms made of? Share with your neighbors. If you know what atoms are made of, 3 primary parts atoms are made of, share with your neighbor. For the middle school students, Dr. Messick is watching, okay? Okay, what are the 3 basic parts of an atom? Who thinks their partner got it right? Okay, back here, right in the middle. What are they? Protons, electrons, and neutrons. Good job, all right? Give them a hand, good job, Tennessee educational system. All right. But here's the deal, it's never as simple as you thought, right? They had to go think, why you gotta go and make things complicated? That's what they did, okay? So if we look at the structure within the atom, there are smaller parts called quarks and things called particles that they're broken down. Now, getting more nerdy, more geeky. For the rest of you who've already checked out, give me about 3 minutes. I'll be back with the rest of the crowd, okay? Now, this was, when I was in college, this was still the hot thing, okay? Quantum physics was really taking off then or whatever. So you could break down protons, neutrons, and electrons into things called quarks and leptons. Now, before I lose everybody in the room, you have 3 generations of matter that fall over that. But then the next question came, what is behind the particles that make up quarks and leptons? And while I was in school, the big thing was there are photons that make up all these things or keep all these things together. Now they've come up with something that I don't know much about. It's called the Higgs boson particle. I started reading about that last night and gave up on that one, okay? There's even a point which I check out, and that was one, okay? So for those of you who are still with me, hang on, you'll see why this is important. Everybody back in, I think you'll get this. If you've ever watched Star Trek, you understand that when we talk about photon energy, that is actually, photon is a word that goes with what? Light. And so what we're learning more and more, this is like 0.0001%. This is what is mass. But what photon energy does, and I'm oversimplifying it a bit, but it holds all matter or mass together. It's like you got this energy that spins around all the molecules, holding them together. Otherwise, the whole universe would just disperse and go to nothing, okay? And so this photon, this is just fact now. The photon light energy is the energy that pushes the electrons to go around. It's the energy that holds all matter and mass together. That's what light does. And it moves at the speed of light. We can't even see it. Now watch what Paul writes by the enlightenment of the Holy Spirit about who Jesus is, the light of the universe. It says, for by him, Jesus, all things were created in heaven and on earth, whether visible or invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. Now watch. When he says that things were created for Jesus, what question is he answering? Purpose. He's answering the why. Why do we have creation? Why do we have purpose? Where do we find it? In Jesus. But then not only does he say that, Jesus being the light of the universe, the light of the world, he says, he is before all things. He's pre-existent. Nothing was created but by him and through him. But in him, all things hold together. Jesus, the light of the universe, this driving logos behind it all, is the one that's just holding all of the universe together. This idea of light energy that comes off when you see something being created, or let me say it another way. We see energy as light. Whenever there's a massive release of energy, our eyes can catch that in the form of light. We would just self-describe that as light. I'll give you an example. If you've just poured a bunch of gasoline all over your fire pit, okay, don't practice this at home, all right? Trained professionals only. And you take a match, and as you throw that match toward the bonfire, your wood that's got gas all over it, many men have said this at some point in their life. You just want to take on the image of God that is in you. You throw that match toward the fire and you say, let there be light. And every man, you feel like such a man when you make something explode. Do you not? Like there's something in men that says, this is the image that, now you can tell your wife or your girlfriend, it's the image of God in me, okay? I'm just being creative here. I'm creating light energy. When you let there be life, boom, you throw it and then your eyebrows are gone, all right? So God didn't do that. But what he's communicating is when that light energy is released, when God released the light of the universe, which is Jesus, when he says to Jesus, I'm going to create all this universe through you, the metaphor he uses is Jesus as the light of the world. Paul explains this to the people of Corinth. There is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist. Again, for whom we exist. What's that answering? Question of why, purpose. And one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. In him, Paul speaks to the Greek philosophers on Mars Hill in Athens. In him we live and move and have our being, even as some of your own poets have said. He's doing the same thing John says. Let's start where we all share a belief in common. There is a driving force and purpose to this universe, and he is saying this, John 1:9, back to the main text. The true light, the true meaning of the universe, the true creative act and force behind everything we know and hold dear. It gives light, watch this, to everyone. Everyone can see the hand of God in creation. Everyone, no matter what background, religious background you're from, you can observe. You can look around you in the order of the universe and not recognize that there is some force behind this all. And what he's saying is that light, that force of the universe, came into the world as a person. He was in the world, and the world, look at the word he uses here for world, Greek word, the cosmos. It's their word he uses here. This thing you've studied, this force and purpose behind all the universe, it was made through this light of the world, yet the world didn't know him. He came and people didn't recognize him. We just experienced something this past week, the eclipse, which is really amazing. And if you're a nerd, you're just so enthralled by this stuff. It took everything in me not to drive 5 hours to go watch it. But what they said about this most recent eclipse is that more human beings saw this eclipse than any other eclipse in the history of the world. Like, how do you know that? And then it makes total sense. If you look at the cities that this hit, God sent this by. Look, it through major cities in Mexico, but the ones we would know, San Antonio, Austin, Waco, Fort Worth, Dallas, Tyler, Texas, Texarkana, Hot Springs, Arkansas, Fort Smith, Arkansas, Little Rock, Jonesboro, the metropolis of Paducah was in that, all right? Like Paducah, big city, I know, all right? But Terre Haute, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, Akron, Cleveland, Erie, all the way up Syracuse, New York, all the way up Burlington, New Hampshire. Do y'all follow what I'm saying? It's like more major cities were in this path than any other. And I love what I saw on astronomy.com this week. I was just reading all about it. I'm just geeking out. And I caught this paragraph. It's amazing. This is what it writes. It says, the sun's diameter is approximately 400 times larger than the moon, which is roughly 400 times further away. This means that both the solar and lunar disks appear to be the same size. What a coincidence, it says. I'm not saying what a coincidence. They write, what a coincidence. My friends, listen, that takes more faith than the faith we share. That all this just happened by chance, but it extends much further than the relative size to the moon and our sun. Geek out with me a minute on this video.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
If you like that, you can find more of those videos at reasonablefaith.org. But I'd like to just close with these thoughts over the next just 5 minutes. As we see, John saying, Jesus was in the world. He is the force and the order beyond the cosmos. He's explained this at the end of his prologue here. He says, this is the way Paul says it: God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, watch this, have been clearly perceived ever since the foundation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. Why is that significant to understand this? Is that all the men and women that you just saw in that video where they were quoting about the order behind the universe, none of them claim to be evangelical Bible-believing Christians. But more and more, the more we study science and the more we get true knowledge, the more we recognize there is not a chance that there's not some driving force of order behind this universe. It's not possible. And so John writes, this force, this light of the world, this logos, this meaning, this purpose came to his own. His own people did not receive him, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name. What does that mean? To believe in his authority over themselves and creation. He gave the right to become children of God. Not everybody's a child of God, but everyone has the right to that. They have the knowledge. It's there. The stars pour out the speech. People, now watch this. This is what I got to communicate this to you today. What he's communicating here is if you receive and you understand that there is a God of order who ordered this universe, if you understand that Jesus is the light that drives it all and that gives us purpose, watch this. We were reborn, we were born again through this knowledge, not of blood nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but that is true of you if you sit here in these seats with faith today, but because you were born of God. Do you realize what John's saying here? If you get this, you only get it because of the grace of God. Because the devil is blinding everyone else to this truth. There's not one person in this room today that is here because you are smarter than the next guy. There's not one person here. Listen, my grandma had a 3rd grade education, and she knows more about purpose in life than everybody you just saw quoted up here. All the knowledge in the world can't point you to understand the name and the grace and the authority of Jesus, but the Spirit of God can regenerate your heart just like He did Jessie Swain when she was a young girl. If you believe, it is not because you're smarter. If you believe, it's because you are that way because of the will of God. And he writes, and the Word became flesh. This meaning became a human being, and He dwelt, which means He pitched His tent. He decided to camp out with us. And we have seen His glory. That means His attributes. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, and He's full of grace and truth. For from His fullness we have all received grace upon grace. Now, when he says all here, he means all. What do I mean by that? Every human being, to the person who's not persuaded yet, what he's communicated here is if you have the ability to listen and understand, to the ability to read what I'm writing, he's saying, then God has given you grace upon grace upon grace. He's given you oxygen to breathe. He's given you the gift of life. He's given you the ability to reason. He's given you the ability to observe. He's given you the ability to recognize that there's an order and a force and a meaning behind this. And all the philosophers on Mars Hill, all the guys in Rome, all the people in Israel had this one thing in common. God gave them the ability to think through these things. But yet, if it's not for the grace of God that brings truth into our lives, none of us would ever believe. And so what I want us to recognize here today is, man, it is so important as followers of Christ that we speak the truth if we know the truth. But what many churches fail in today, especially evangelical churches, is while we say that which is true, we don't love very well. It doesn't sound very loving. And on the flip side, there are a lot of churches out there that are very loving and they accept everybody, but they won't speak the truth to people because they're afraid it'll be unloving. And the balance we all have to find, and what John's going to do is equip us throughout this book, is by modeling witness after witness after witness after witness that is brought up on the stand. And eventually he's going to bring the big witness to the stand, whose name is Jesus, to declare to us, this is the truth. But Jesus always did it in love. Do you get that? The offer of grace has been given to everyone. Grace upon grace upon grace. But we got to make sure that we're not so busy making a point that we cease to make a difference. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.